Hey everyone, Mr. Wineland here. We're gonna kind of quickly go over Chapter 13, Section 1 here. We're kind of going into a new era. We're going to be talking a little bit about um, the Roaring Twenties during Calvin Coolidge's time as president of the United States, and very interesting time. Has had a lot of a movement to a different direction in our country. A lot of different things happening, building up at this time that we have never seen before in our country's history. But we're going to kind of talk about some of those things and kind of move forward. Um, we talked more about the politics of the 1920s. We're going to kind of get a little bit away from that, kind of talk about the shifts of the culture in the United States. We see that America definitely changed a lot through this time. We see that throughout the 1920s, we see about 51.2% of Americans lived in communities with populations of 2,500 or to more than 1 million. What that means is that you're seeing more people going into urban settings, much larger communities. People are less isolated. We're not seeing as many big farm communities as we thought. You're seeing a little bit more of a connectionness with society. We see this between 1922 to 1929. We're seeing that nearly 2 million people are leaving farms and towns each year going into the cities. And so we're becoming less agriculturally based and we're becoming more urban based. And so we're starting to also see that as these small towns and farms are kind of, losing their people, we're also seeing the morality of these towns change. We're seeing the morality of cities change, and we're seeing America's kind of taking a different step in how they go about, enjoying life and appreciating life. And so we see in the 1920s, New York had a population of 5.6 million. Topping the list of big cities at that time. Chicago grew massively, nearly 3 million people during the 1920s, and Philadelphia nearly 2 million. So we're seeing 65 other cities had over 100,000 people. And so this is growing, and people are starting to go into city life. Why? Because it's booming. It's different. It's different from small towns. Like small towns, everybody knows everybody. There's a lot of, excuse me, my hair is kind of a little goofy today. But small towns, everybody knows everybody, and there's not as much stuff to do. Whereas you look at big cities, there's a lot more industry going on there. You're seeing that African Americans are starting to move there, immigrants moving there because there's more opportunity for jobs. We're seeing that each day an estimated 300,000 workers, 150,000 cars. The president, still the right. Sorry, my computer kind of went off there. You're also seeing that each day, it's busy, it's busing, it's just moving. It's moving constantly. We see at night, it definitely was vibrant. There was a lot of things going on. People weren't just staying in the house. There was a lot of variety shows. Small town migrants adapting to the urban environment was a lot different because, a small town, they had a few things here and there to go hang out and enjoy, but nothing to the competition that you see in the urban setting. You're seeing a lot more social life happening. City dwellers were able to go out and drink and gamble, and casual dating was also a part of that, something that you would not see in a small town, a little bit more morals going on there. But you're also seeing other things happening throughout the 1920s as, things are different. There is a bit of a tug of war about, the safety or security of a smaller town to that of a big city, larger crowds, moneymakers, pleasure seekers. It's a lot different, but that difference is what brings people to those cities. Your answer to number one is here in blue right here on your study guide. But one vigorous clash between small town and big city Americans is the 18th Amendment. The 18th Amendment really comes into play here. We talked a little bit about this, the idea of prohibition in the late 1800s. There was definitely a push for prohibition. Some states were already heading towards that, but they wanted more of a national setting. Ignore the bell there. but we see that there's definitely something that really caused this, and so really pushed this movement to move further. And that was the idea that, hey, alcohol is bad. Alcohol needs to go away. And the only way to do that was pass an amendment. And that is your answer number one, 18th Amendment. And then prohibition right here is, sorry, it was in the blue. The 18th Amendment launched this era known as prohibition. And the 18th Amendment basically outlawed the manufacture, sale, transportation of alcoholic beverages, so they were legally prohibited. Reformers had a long consideration of liquor or prime. They thought it was a prime cause for corruption. Some thought drinking led to crime, wife and child abuse, accidents on the job, other serious social problems. I mean, part of this was you had individuals, and I think I've told this story. I forgot that. Gosh, I'd have to look up the guy's name. But he was from Ohio, and he was part of the American Saloon League, where basically anti-American Saloon League, where basically he had gotten stabbed by a pitchfork because one of the workers on his parents' farm had been drunk, and he peddled that story around, of like, hey, when I was young, I was stabbed by a pitchfork because the guy was drunk, and really trying to build it up to where people feared, like, I too could get stabbed by a pitchfork. No, that was an isolated incident. And yes, the person who was drunk was irresponsible. But let's be honest, like, not every day somebody's going to be stabbed by a pitchfork by someone who's drunk. But those types of stories were being peddled out there. It really built up people's fears. And all it did was, instead of having a conversation of, look, people are just going to drink because that's just who we are. We're humans. When we want something, most likely we're going to try and do everything we can to get it, especially if it's legal. So instead of having a good conversation of like, okay, what measures can we put in place to protect people just in case somebody abuses this? Instead, people are like, no, let's just try to keep people from getting drunk in the first place. You can't do that. You can't regulate people's I guess what's the word I'm trying to say? Desires. You can't always regulate people's desires. I could say to my kids, hey, don't eat that piece of candy. You shouldn't eat candy. Candy's bad. Candy, no, no, no. But most likely my kids love candy. Let's be honest. I love candy. I love chocolate. And it's very hard for me to say, no, don't eat that, Phil. No, don't eat that, my child, Austin and Grace, or Corey. Those are my kids' names. But anyway, I could say no, but you know what? They want that piece of candy. They're going to try and find ways to get that piece of candy. So it's very hard to regulate somebody's desires and pleasures. That's how we're human. And so and addiction is real. Addiction is it can be very small to something like candy, and it can be very big to something like alcohol. So it is out there, but we see this happening. And so there's a support from the South and the West. A lot of native-born Protestants, the church is going to get involved to try and implement the 18th Amendment. Your answer number two answer number two is right here: the Anti-Saloon League and the Women's Christian Temperance Union. And so the church definitely had a role in this. With the Anti-Saloon League, it definitely had a drive to get this idea of passing prohibition. And we talked a little bit about this, ignore the bell, with the Women's Christian Temperance Movement with Carrie Nation. Carrie Nation, if you remember, used to go around and just destroy saloons. We talked about that in previous chapters. But this was a big push to get rid of alcohol. And so at first, saloons were closed their doors, and arrests for drunkenness declined aftermath of World War I. But many Americans were tired of making sacrifices. At some point, people wanted to drink. And you have to understand, there's a lot of immigrants where drinking is a big part of their culture. You have soldiers who just suffered a world war, who want to drink off their sorrows. So these are situations that are happening, and people are trying to find ways to drink. And drinking was a big part of socialization, and it was very hard to, again, implement or control people's desires. You cannot do that. It's hard. You can regulate certain things, but it's hard. So it became a bit of an issue. So ultimately, the biggest reason why this failed is enforcing the law. And that's the thing. Eventually, the government's going to learn, like, oh, we can enforce this, but we can't keep people from just drinking totally. Like, we have to set some boundaries. But it's going to take a while to do that. The Volstead Act established the Prohibition Bureau and Treasury Department in 1919, but the agency was underfunded, so enforcing was very hard. The job of enforcement involved patrolling 18,700 miles of coastline as well as inland borders, and it just became hard. You had to deal with dealing with distilling liquor equipment, monitoring highways, for illegal alcohol being transported, overseeing industries illegally used alcohol. It's difficult. It's like saying we're gonna regulate the border. We're gonna keep people from coming in to the United States of America. It's hard. It's hard to enforce immigration because you've got, not only do you have a border along the southern and the northern border, but you also got airplanes and cars and things. So it's hard to regulate things like this. So you have to figure out reasonable, logical solutions that can help you enforce these laws. But the problem was back then they didn't have them. Big problem is they only had 1,500 poorly paid federal agents to even handle the job, and they couldn't do it. So to obtain liquor illegally, drinkers went to what is called speakeasies. And so this is your definition. They were underground to hidden saloons or night bars. So-called inside, one spoke quietly or easily to avoid detection. Basically, what ended up happening is saloons just turned into speakeasies. Like on the surface, it looked like, oh, we don't serve alcohol here, but really they did. They had codes and things that were like, I would like a Dr. Pepper. Now I'm winking, and I don't think they did that like that, but I'm pretty sure when they saw the I'll get you your Dr. Pepper, that was code for get me a such and such drink. So sometimes that's what they would do. So speakeasies could, be found everywhere: penthouses, cellars, office buildings, houses, tenements, hardware stores, tea rooms. To be admitted, again, you had to present a card, sometimes a password, sometimes inside. One would find a mix of fashionable middle class and upper class men and women. Before long, people started getting bolder on the idea of figuring out ways around to distill their own alcohol, and so that became a big deal. Your definition, for bootleggers is all right here. So what we see is since alcohol was allowed for medicinal religious purposes, we see that prescriptions, we see alcohol and sales of sacramental wine would skyrocket during this time. Oh yeah, I'm religious, even though probably most likely that person is not. But it's like medical marijuana. When the medical marijuana came out, the biggest joke, and I know a few sitcoms that kind of joked about this, but people were like, "Oh, marijuana is legal, but you got to have a medical card." Well, okay. Well, how do I do that? Oh, go see the doctor and tell them all these symptoms, and you get this medical card, and blah 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 blah. Then you're able to have access. Well, that's kind of what that was. That type of scenario that we have seen today with medical marijuana. That's kind of what happened with alcohol. Is oh well, I'm very religious. I need alcohol, so you had to get a card or something to prove that I need this because it's part of my faith. So people abuse that, and that became a problem, especially those who could not do it that way. Found bootleggers. These are individuals who smuggled in, carrying liquor in their boots. They would smuggle it in from Canada, Cuba, and the West Indies, which is your answer number 3. These 3 countries right there. If you need to pause, feel free to do so. We see prohibition not only generated disrespect for the law, it also contributed to the organized crime in nearly every major city. We see Chicago became notorious at home, as the home of Al Capone, gangster whose bootlegging empire netted over 60 million a year. And Al Capone, the thing about Al Capone is that he used this as an opportunity to basically, okay, um, how can I easily make money? I got it. I'm going to sell legal alcohol. And he found a way to do it, distill it on his own. It really pay off, excuse me, pay off the police to do that. And he would also take out his opponents too, who were basically his competition. So there's one particular day where during the 1920s, headlines reported 522 bloody gang killings made the image of flashy Al Capone part of the folklore of that period. I think, oh gosh, what was it called? It was like some bloody Valentine's Day or something. But Al Capone basically on Valentine's Day sent in. There were some cops that went over to his competitors, and they basically made them go line up against the wall, put their hands on the wall. They were going to be arrested. Well, turns out they pull out a Tommy gun, which cops never had Tommy guns. They just didn't. They didn't have the machine, which Tommy guns are machine gun. They did not have Tommy guns, and these guys did, which is a sign that they worked for Capone, and they shot and killed his opponents. And so in 1940, the writer Herbert Ashbury recalled the Capone era in Chicago and wrote about all of his misdeeds. It's interesting. Al Capone does get arrested and eventually charged, but not for killing, but for tax evasion. So we see by the mid-1920s, only 19% of Americans supported prohibition. The rest who wanted the amendment changed or repealed believed that prohibition caused worse effects than the initial problem, which actually became a big issue because, the thing was, it was like, we need to do this for the children because crime is on the rise with people getting drunk and blah, 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 blah. And look, yeah, there was some concerns with alcohol on the rise, especially with the automobile. We're seeing, drunk driving is occurring, and you're also seeing abuses in certain areas. But, it wasn't as bad as we had thought, but, it gets worse when they get rid of alcohol. So we see rural Protestant Americans, however, defended the law. They felt that it strengthened moral values. But the 18th Amendment remained in force until 1933 when it was repealed in the 21st Amendment how they repealed it was, the beginning was, we need to have the 18th Amendment for the children. Well, they repealed it by saying, we're doing this for the children because the crime was a problem. And so it's the irony of the whole situation. Another bitter controversy highlighting the growing rift between tradition and modern ideas is the 1920s came over the battle of fundamentalism with certain groups when it came to evolution. Fundamentalism, your definition is here in blue. And basically, fundamentalism was the Protestant movement grounded in literal and non-symbolic interpretation of the Bible. And so fundamentalism was basically what the Bible says. If God made the earth in 7 days, he made the earth in 7 days. If Moses split the sea in two, or the sea in two, then boom, they split the sea in two. So there's and look, I'm one that does think that the Bible should be taken literally to an extent, yes, but to understand a little bit the culture and the history of the Bible, it has different writing styles and themes. It is a narrative. It is a historic document. It is also poetry. And each of them are written in many different ways and are interpreted in many different ways. So, and I would say a lot of responsible, well-known preachers would even say you have to be very careful about taking the Bible too literally. Not saying don't take the Bible literally, because to them, a Christian would say it is God's word, and it is God's word. But the thing is again, they would say do not take it too literally, because the Bible is written in three different themes. And it's written with poetry, it's written with the narrative, with the historical reference, and that kind of tends to change how you read the Bible. So, but at that point in time, though, in the 1920s, people didn't view the Bible that way. They didn't. They took it too literally. And when they took it too literally, they tend to ignore some of the scientific discoveries, theories that are backed up with facts. And they believe that the Bible was inspired by God, which that is what a lot of Christians believe, and therefore the stories or details were true. And there's nothing wrong for them to believe that. However, there's certain things that we cannot ignore in this world, and especially when certain theories, which a theory is it's not a, hey, I just have an idea and it's my theory. And if you don't like it, that's tough, too bad. No, that's not how science works. That's your hypothesis. That's your idea's hypothesis. The theory is you have to prove it through evidence. And so the evidence will show that your theory is right or wrong. So that's kind of what the idea is, or your hypothesis is right or wrong. The theory is, showing that there is a theory. Anyway, but so Charles Darwin, in the 19th century figured out evolution and, kind of going into natural selection and theory stating that plant and animal species had developed and changed over millions of years. And that became a bit of an issue for fundamentalists, especially when it came to teaching evolution in school. And so this became a bit of an issue over, the days that God, made humans and made the world. So the South and West, preachers led revivals based on the authority of Scripture and less on science. And so people like Billy Sunday, a former baseball player turned preacher, went across the South preaching this and pushing this. And we see in Los Angeles, Amy Semple McPherson used Hollywood showmanship to preach the word to the homesick, the Midwestern migrants, and devoted followers in her radio broadcast in the 1920s. Fundamentalists is starting to grow and prohibit teaching evolution. Well, this is eventually going to get challenged, which leads to what is called the Scopes trial. And so in March of 1925 in Tennessee, we see in Dayton, Tennessee, we're going to see one of the bigger cases in the history of court cases. Immediately, the American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU, which was a new organization defending the civil liberties of people. Now, here's the thing about the American Civil Liberties Union. A lot of people think, well, all they do is defend, one side, and that's it, the left, or they don't defend conservative values. That's actually not true. They actually will defend both sides of the status quo. That is kind of how the ACLU works. They definitely are representing the freedoms and liberties of people. That is how they do it. But again, it's and there's some people who love them and hate them. They're a very polarizing organization, and honestly, they don't care. That's kind of what they're there for. They're there to challenge things and to challenge in protection of your civil liberties. So that's kind of how they're viewed. But back then, they kind of definitely started out that way too, with the John T. Scopes trial. Now, John T. Scopes, let's be real here. Let's get some history on this. A lot of people think, oh, the Scopes trial, it was this big trial that, oh my goodness, it was built up to be like one of the trials of the century. And that, this poor man, John T. Scopes. All he was trying to do is teach evolution. And, this small town in Tennessee just kept him from doing it. Oh, blah, 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 blah. And actually what ended up happening is the ACLU was promoting this advertising and saying, hey, we'll defend any teacher. Hey, we're going to defend anybody who's teaching evolution, and they're being denied that opportunity to teach evolution. And so Dayton, Tennessee, it's struggling in the 1925 economically. They need attention. They need people to go, we're on the map, come to Tennessee, you're going to love it, kind of thing. So one lawyer thinks, how can we bring attention to our town? I got it. Let's have the trial of the century here. And that's what ends up happening is they find John T. Scopes. He's a coach and he's a biology teacher. And they're like, hey, you've taught evolution before, right? Yeah, I might have mentioned it in class or something. Well, you need to bring it up and let me know have you been persecuted, right? Yeah, oh yeah, I was persecuted when I brought it up in class. Okay, well we're going to use you. And he was basically just a guinea pig, just so that they can have this trial here. And so they end up the Scopes trial. Scopes is arrested, and there's a trial set in July. And the ACLU decides to hire Clarence Darrow, who's this big time attorney for the trial. And so this trial is going to be, it's got crowds of hundreds of people, and it got up to the thousands. I think they had to have it outside. It just got so crazy that even it's so big that William Jennings Bryan, the 3-time Democratic candidate, we talked a little bit about him, a big-time fundamentalist, became special prosecutor for this case. There was no real question of guilt. Scopes eventually, really it was like, yeah, I taught evolution in class. I mean, it's no secret. So really was kind of more of the fight over evolution being taught in the classroom. So that's kind of really was. It was more of science versus religion. And this thing was so popular they got broadcast on the radio. So we see trial opened on July 10th of 1925 and overnight became the national sensation. It's kind of like, when I was a kid, they used to have a channel called Court TV, and sometimes there have been some big cases like the O.J. Simpson trial, or there was some other big, like the Menendez brothers trial, and I remember when those trials would happen, Court TV would be on the case. They would be broadcasting inside the courtroom, or they would have analysis all day about it, and it just got to a point where it was like, look, I mean, it's good to cover somebody's cases, but somebody died. Somebody died. This is no longer entertaining anymore. We're watching a court case of somebody who may or may not have committed this crime. A crime was committed, and glorifying that is not okay. So it got to a point where it was like, and so that I think Court TV is now what is called True TV, and so they've rebranded and changed their format and everything. But kind of got off track there. But what I'm trying to say is that type of scope of the popularity of these big trials started with the Scopes trial, and the Scopes trial was covered on the radio, and so we see. And by the way, your definition for William Jennings Bryan is right here in the blue. I forgot if I told you. He was called as an expert on the Bible, questioned about his beliefs. So that's your definition for William Jennings Bryan. So Darrow was going to go up there and be like, hey, I got all these scientists that are going to prove that evolution exists, and you're going to be mind blown. Ooh. So evolution should be taught in school. But the judge was a big time fundamentalist himself and was like, no, I can't allow you to have these scientists in my courtroom. So no, they're not going to testify. So Darrow's going, well, crud, that was pretty much my whole case. What am I going to do? Aha, I got an idea. William Jennings Bryan has been bragging like, oh, I know everything about the Bible, and I'm a fundamentalist, and I'm this, and I'm that, and I'm cool, and I'm going to prove you wrong, and evolution sucks, blah, blah, blah. So what ends up happening is he's like, I'm going to call this guy to the stand. So he calls Bryan to the stand to question him about his beliefs about the Bible. Well, this thing was so big. It got so big it went outside to as tons of people showed up. And so Bryan was questioned about it, and Bryan stood firm on the stand, and Darrow asked him everything about, when was the earth created, and Bryan's sticking to his guns. And finally Darrow asked Bryan, do you think the earth was made in 6 days? And Bryan answered, not 6 days of 24 hours. And people sitting in the lawn gasped. And I know this sounds silly, but it's like, at the time you have to understand, like, because people took things so literally, that when somebody steps away from the norm, that is going to, people sometimes process it in this like big exaggerate way. But it was big because it really hurt Bryan's case that, everything's literal. When the Bible says it was 6 days, it was 6 days. And so, and Bryan's basically admitting on the stand that there are different ways to interpret the Bible, that it's not a literal sense. That hurt Bryan's case. Now, did that destroy his case? No, it did not. Now, but here's the funny thing. Darrow which is not in the textbook. They don't talk about this story. So anyway, Darrow did expose Brian, and he kind of made a good argument. So then it came, and so what ends up happening is they're coming down to the last day, and they're going to have to do their closing arguments. And Brian's like working on this thing, going, "I'm going to get him." Brian, he embarrassed me on the stand. I'm going to get Darrow. I'm going to hit him hard with the best argument ever. Blah 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 blah. What ends up happening is Darrow, because remember he's defending Scopes. Goes, yeah, the defense rests. Well, when the defense rests, the prosecution does not get the opportunity to argue, because if the defense does not do a closing argument, then the prosecution can't do a closing argument as well. So that frustrated Brian and made him so mad. But here's the reason why Darrow did that. Because, that in Tennessee, he was going to lose. He knew it was a losing cause. He does lose. He was found, Scopes was found guilty and paid a fine of $100. Ooh. But $100 probably was a lot of money back then. But anyway, Darrow knew that this was covered on the radio nationally. And everybody on the radio listening, the majority of the people listening on the radio agreed with Darrow and knew that he won. And so that's all he wanted, because now he got the attention. He was hoping to move it to the Tennessee Supreme Court. And we eventually see that the Tennessee Supreme Court would change the verdict. So that was the whole plan of the ACLU. It was never to win the Scopes trial. It was to get it up to a higher court that would say, you know what? Sorry, we're going to have to overrule that law, or that decision you made. So we see that the class silver revolution, prohibition, was a big whole experiment in the 1920s, and definitely caused a lot of issues, but never going to go away. It still, in some ways, carries on even in today's time. All right, that's going to do it for 13.1. We'll see you at 13.2. Bye, guys.